Hello, and welcome back to another video. This time making a 10mm Hillfort for use in Argatoria, and maybe Warmaster. Starting out with some polystyrene and some foamcore, gluing a few pieces together to make the shape of the hill, mounted on a foamcore base. Then taking a knife and trimming out the edge of the base before trimming it further, so it's more of a smooth edge. Around the back of the piece, where there's going to be a cliff edge, I found a curved knife blade was a lot easier to work with. With the core of the hill in place, I took some styrofoam and etched a rough cobblestone texture so I could make a few towers and a few retaining walls. Then taking some blue styrofoam, these would become the natural stone elements such as the rock faces and a few outcroppings. I played around with a few structure types before settling on a single keep that would sit above the entire piece and act as a central feature for the fort, with a few towers poking out the sides, using more styrofoam to detail in some brickwork and some crenellations. "10mm scale terrain is still something I'm very new to, and this piece provided a lot of interesting challenges, but it was quite nice to be able to try and build a 10mm scale building and see how that would feel and look at the end. With the various fortifications built, I took hot glue and attached them to the base, using the blue styrofoam rock to build up a cliff face and fill in any gaps around them. There are a few extra details that needed adding at this stage, such as the gateways and the stairs leading up to the tower. With all the building elements down and the stonework, I moved on to sculptor mold, and I did this in a few different stages. So the first one would be purely to fill in the worst of the gaps, and to bulk up the earth outside of the fort. I also used it to blend the cliff face together at the back, which was made out of styrofoam offcuts, textured with a tinfoil ball. Rather than waste more sculptor mold, I filled in some of the gaps using cardboard and matte Mod Podge to glue it in place. Then for the gaps on the stonework, I used some concrete texture paste from Hobbycraft, applying it with a sculpting tool. The cliff face around the back was also looking a bit too rectangular, so I went in with my fingers and the tinfoil ball to round out the worst of the edges. At this stage it was also looking a bit too clean and rectangular, so I applied some damage to the gate towers, using a knife to put in a rough brick shape on the rubble. Then also used the knife to part a bit of the brickwork on the edges, so you'd get some general wear and tear, as well as some battle damage. The area past the main gate was also looking a bit bland, so I decided to add a postern gate, taking a small block of styrofoam, texturing in a door frame, then trying to blend it into the rock face, so you'd have a small tiny hidden door that the defenders could sally out of. It is one of the advantages of using hobby materials, in that you can just remove areas of them and trim them down, so the sculptor mold and styrofoam easily cut away under a knife, which allowed me to place the door in. There was a small gap around the edge of the top of the tower, so cutting some tiny flagstones, I applied them around the edge of the building, using matte Mod Podge to secure them. Then moving to the main wall, adding some crenellations on top, out of rectangles of styrofoam, and more matte Mod Podge. At this point, the first bits of sculptor mold had dried, so I went in with a second coat and filled the areas that I'd missed, as well as filled up any gaps that had been revealed when the sculptor mold dried. Next up, taking fine sand, PVA, and black gesso, as well as a few little bits of cork flock. I mixed up a texture paste and applied it all over the ground. While that was still wet, I patted it down to make sure the area on the top was flat, and smoothed a few areas with a wet finger. Once I'd given the texture paste long enough to be fully dry, I went in with black gesso and primed the entire piece. At this point I noticed a few more gaps, so going in with more of the concrete texture paste from Hobbycraft, I filled in the area on top of the gate, and then applied a layer beneath the gate and to form a path going down the hill, so it would be texturally different from the areas around it. This then got a layer of black gesso to match the rest of the piece. No big surprises in the painting stage here. I followed up the black gesso with a layer of burnt umber, hitting both the stonework and the ground, before following it up with white paint hitting only the stonework, and then giving another pass over the ground with a tan sand colour. Here's where I deviate from my normal paint scheme. So I mixed up a bit of the tan colour with some of the umber, as well as a bit of white paint to make a sort of more orangey earth tone, and apply that around the outside of the earth. I did this as I felt the stonework and the ground was a bit too similar, and I wanted to bump the contrast up a bit. I then filled the stonework up with another dry brush of white paint, focusing mostly on the top parts. Taking an old knackered brush and some matte Mod Podge, I started dabbing the glue around the outside of the base, before hitting it with a static grass applicator and some autumnal coloured grass, so it would match the other hills I did a few weeks ago. I felt like the piece was missing something, so I went in and added a few more details and decorations, starting off with an extra building to put on top of the main keep, using a 10mm Argatoria Mini to scale the doors. I also used the pointy edge of a sculpting tool to poke more of the cobblestone stonework in and match the rest of the keep. Around the cliffs it also needed a bit more greenery, which I filled in with some green foam flock. Taking a darker green clump foliage, I then applied a few clumps of that around the base as well. I did do a mistake by putting the door frame in without a gate in place, so I took some packaging foam, compressed it down, poked it into the gate so it would form a barrier, then used that as the basis to glue the door onto. To blend a bit of the paintwork at the edges and darken it down, I took watered down black paint and started damming it over the edge so I could highlight a few areas such as the pathway down and help blend the piece onto a board. Taking some square plastic rods, I then created a portcullis by trimming them down to length and using super glue to attach them together. Then taking a small offcut of styrofoam, I drilled a hole in the middle so to create a small well, because after all the defenders probably need something to drink, and it gives the attacker something to poison on the way in. The final touch being a few pyramid type spikes which would sit on top of the new building. So it could also potentially be a temple type thing, or a sort of ambiguous good or evil type Hillfort. I then painted up the new features, adding a little bit of rust to the gate, which is probably way too big for the size and scale, but no one will see the gate anyway. Using matte Mod Podge, I then attached a few pieces in place, and left a few unattached, so the portcullis can be removed at will, and the second building is not attached to the main keep. Finally, I took some pieces of paper, and some watered down matte Mod Podge, and glued them in place on a piece of styrofoam made to match the crenellations at the top of the keep. So in theory, they would glue into the same shape, and can be placed on the top of the building. So I gave them a coat of red paint. Then to weather the edges, I applied a dab of water, then used a scalpel to pull out the very edge and give a nice torn end to the banners. So again, entirely optional, but gives a nice bit of colour contrast to the piece. So there we have it. A Hillfort, in a kind of vaguely barbarian low fantasy style, with a few removable elements, and scaled in approximately 10mm for use in a few different game systems, intentionally being left a little bit agnostic, so it could reasonably be used by a number of different races and species. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.